Hello, everyone. I'll just give folks a couple of minutes here, well, 30 seconds to a minute, just to go ahead and hop on as we start. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful Anti-Canada Day. Hello, friends. Yeah, if you want to put in the chat where you're calling in from, we'd love to know where you're joining us from for Anti-Canada Day, Decolonial Day, if you will. All right, I see folks are continuing to trickle in, but I think I'll maybe just go ahead and get started on a little bit of an introduction here. Again, if folks want to go ahead and just put in the chat on the live stream where you're calling in from, that'd be great. We'd love to see from all across so-called Canada as to where folks are joining us from today. So thanks so much for being here. Just to start us off, hello again, everyone. I'm on a lot of these webinars. My name's Lindsey. I'm the Communications Director at Indigenous Climate Action. I am Chickasaw, Irish, and Polish. That's how I encapsulate my identity, if you will. Again, thank you all for joining us today for our little mini Anti-Canada Day celebration. So we'll just be talking today with some members of ICA Steering Committee. So our steering committee is made up of some awesome Indigenous activists from across so-called Canada, working in various different fields, and they really help to guide the work of ICA, and just kind of our things for moving forward and what we are imagining for our peoples from across so-called Canada and beyond even. So thank you to all of our steering committee members who have joined us today. We have Bryanna, Brendan, Christopher, Maureen, and Daniel. I would also just like to give a shout out to some of the ICA staff as well who helped with planning this event. JC Chiplow, who is our community engagement lead, and also Nigel Henry Robinson, who is our youth engagement lead. Also, just for folks too, we've recently updated our website. We have a fancy new website with fancy new branding and a logo that was made by the fabulous Jordan Stranger. So check out our website for more information about us and the work we do. We also just released our 2019 annual report, so you can look at all the awesome things that we did in 2019. So with that, again, we're here on So-Called Canada Day. And just kind of to give us a little bit of framing, we do recognize that, yes, this is Canada Day, so-called, if you will, but that Canada was also built on oppression and was built on the dispossession of land from Indigenous peoples. So kind of with that, we just thought that what is a way that we can both recognize kind of the history of so-called Canada, but then at the same time also highlight the work that other people are doing, to highlight the work that folks on our steering committee are doing to decolonize Canada, and working towards the empowerment of Indigenous peoples, and really working towards tearing down these various oppressive systems within so-called Canada. So thank you again to everyone for joining us. Just a couple of housekeeping things as well for anyone that is watching. Please feel free to go ahead and put comments, questions into the Facebook live stream. We will have a portion of time where we will try and get to some questions, so please just put them in there. We'll be monitoring them. And then additionally, this webinar will also be available through YouTube within a couple of days. So if you can't stay for the whole time today, or if you would like to send it to anyone else you know as well to share it out, we would greatly appreciate it. So we'll have that up in a couple of days. So stay tuned on our social media for when the video itself gets released as well. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and start introductions with our wonderful group of steering committee members that are here with us today. So I think we're going to go ahead and start with Maureen. Maureen, if you would like to just give us an introduction of yourself.
For sure. Thanks, Lindsay. So, Bojo Nindinaway Maganag, Maureen Nindishnika Jaganashima, Nibakan Manidu Gishikak Nindishnikas, Gawin Machine Ninjakina Masi Nindudem, Fort Francis Nin Nindunji, Gojijing Shinkadayish Konigan, Thunder Bay, Nindayanda Nungum, Nimino Aya, Nimin Wendam, Iawan Oma Nungum. So, hi everyone, my English name is Maureen. I have Ojibwayan settler roots, and I say this to honor all of my ancestors, and more importantly, to acknowledge the privilege I have as a mixed person who is sometimes coded as white and other times as racially ambiguous. I belong to Couchiching First Nation, which is in Treaty 3 territory, and grew up right next door in Fort Francis. I currently live in Thunder Bay. I'm well, and I'm happy to be here today.
Thank you, Maureen. Love hearing our Indigenous languages being spoken. I only know about 6 words in Chickasaw, but I'm working on it, so love hearing it. It's great. And next up, we're going to go to Daniel.
Hello, my name is Daniel Taselli. I am Dene. My people are Kashogotene. I am from Fort Good Hope, which is Radley Ko in our language. It's a small flying community on the Big River that they show, the Mackenzie River on the map. And we're just south of the Arctic Circle. So climate change is a huge issue for us, and I'm honored to be part of the ICA crew. Merci, thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Represent the North. Next up, we have Christopher.
Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. My name is Christopher Reid. I'm a member of the Niska Nation, affiliated with the village of Ginkolith. My paternal family is Niska. I was raised, however, in Epiquet, Mi'kma'ki, Mi'kmaq lands in so-called Prince Edward Island. I'm a Montreal resident. I live in Jojage, and very happy to be here. I'm a father, 2 different work in the urban sort of community here in Montreal, and yeah, really pleased to be a member of ICA Steering Committee. It's an honor to be affiliated with this organization and the movement. Thank you.
Thanks, Christopher. Next up, we have Brendan.
Danse, Bryan Campbell, Stigasan, Egwa, Moniawi Stigaigan, Nipupsin Kayate, and I was kind of Kastaki Niwigan Niguats. So my name is Bryan Campbell. I'm registered through Montreal Lake Cree Nation, which is in Treaty 6 territory. And I have family through houses in Treaty 4 territory. I'm currently residing in Regina. I am Cree and Métis, and I joined the ICA steering committee just this past term. And I'm looking forward to being with some rad Indigenous folks.
Yes, we're happy to have you on, Brendan. And then finally, last but not least, we have Bryanna.
Atili, hi, Bryanna Ibunga. Happy Anti-Canada Day. I'm happy to be here celebrating Anti-Canada Day with you all. I am Inuk from Nunavut, Labrador, and I am currently living on unceded Algonquin territory in Ottawa. I am a land protector. I am an Indigenous community support worker working in anti-human trafficking. I enjoy advocating for the rights of women, Indigenous peoples, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls plus, environmental injustice in relation to MMIWG plus, environmental injustice in relation to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I think I just said that, honestly, but I'm nervous. Persons with disabilities, mental health, food security among Indigenous communities, human trafficking, and children in the child welfare system and immigration rights. And that's just a bit of what I do. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Bryanna. All of the things, love all of this work that everyone is doing. Yeah, and just all the different interests of everyone. And so just kind of hopping off of that as well, again, thank you all for introducing yourselves. We're just gonna get into just talking a little bit about everyone's work. So just kind of the different things you're working on in terms of Indigenous rights, Indigenous sovereignty, decolonization, all of the different things, all the good things that we're pushing for. So just to kick us off with that, we're gonna go ahead with Daniel, if you wanna just tell us a little bit about the work that you do.
All right. I apologize in advance for going through something that is going to sound like a boring resume, but I feel like half my life has been a fight for credibility. And I think some of this stuff is important to contextualize some of the comments I want to make later on. So I'll just mention that I'm on a few boards right now. In addition to the ICA steering committee, I'm on the board of Eco Justice, which is a large environmental nonprofit legal organization located in so-called Canada. I'm also on the boards of a couple organizations south of the US-Canada border. One is the Indigenous Peoples Power Project, which focuses on providing nonviolent direct action training for Indigenous communities and connecting those communities with Indigenous trainers in nonviolent direct action. And I'm on the board of the Water Protector Legal Collective, which formed out of the frontline resistance at Standing Rock and was focused predominantly on ensuring that water protectors and land defenders had adequate legal defense for the charges that were brought against them. That work has since expanded to include a lot of international human rights work with a focus on Indigenous people. I'm also a founding member of Dene Nawo, which is an organization of mostly young Dene located in the north, focused on fostering emerging leadership, but also more broadly, embracing a mission statement of land, language, culture forever. So outside of that work, I've spent the last few years of my life working as a lawyer and working on that side of these issues, more of the legal side and the side that really interacts with and engages with state power in those more state-sanctioned forums. So I was a practicing lawyer for about 2.5 years. I quit that just over a year ago. For about 3.5 years, I've been a negotiator for self-government agreements up here in Denendeh. Prior to that, though, prior to going to law school, for about 10 years on and off, I have been involved with a variety of initiatives that were outside of the state-sanctioned ways for change making. So I've been involved in some direct action. I'm a student trainer of nonviolent direct action. And have been involved in a lot of creative resistance to directly challenge power around issues of climate change, climate justice, and Indigenous rights. So I've approached issues of climate change and Indigenous rights from, in a sense, both sides of that fence. And I want to talk a little bit about that later on. Merci, thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. It's so cool, like, hearing members of the steering committee, because of course, like, you know, I've read your bios, like, you know, we know your bios and whatnot, but it's nice to be able to hear folks be able to speak to their own work as well. It's really great to hear. Daniel, you also have such like a podcast voice. I feel like you could have like a radio show as well. Future thoughts. Next, we're gonna throw it to Brendan.
Hi. My work really only began in, let's say, the last 4 or 5 years of my life, through student organizing. When I attended university out in Ontario, I got involved slowly in international climate organizing. So in 2016, in November, I attended the 22nd Conference of Parties, or COP24, in Marrakesh, Morocco. And it was there that I got introduced into international Indigenous organizing spaces through the UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then again in 2018, I attended COP24 in Katowice, Poland. So as the part of my organizing that kind of relates to the work of ICA has largely been quite international. I was part of like organizing a national level conference out of Ottawa in 2018, as well. And that was called Power Shift, for folks who might remember that, or it was 2019, I guess. Yeah, so my organizing has largely been on international level, and trying to advocate for Indigenous rights. Usually it was the older Indigenous folks that take on the more diplomacy parts of that work, and then us youth would take on like the organizing and interacting with media. And yeah, I haven't really been involved too much in organizing lately. I've just kind of returned home about a year ago now. But yeah, that's kind of the work that I have that kind of relates to ICA and relates to that type of stuff. Yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Brendan. I was actually at Power Shift. I think Bryanna was as well. So yes, very cool. That I think a lot of the people that I organize with now are definitely folks that I met through Power Shift. So very cool to have all of that kind of come full circle. Next, we're gonna go. Speaking of Bryanna, we're gonna go to Bryanna next. Let us know about your work.
Okay. Yeah, I actually was at the Power Shift Young and Rising conference that Brendan had helped organize, and I had a wonderful experience. I met so many great people, and Brendan had made sure that we were really safe and doing well during the whole time we were there. So I'm really grateful for how he had successfully organized that conference and done so well. So thank you. So apart from working in anti-human trafficking to further pursue my goals in advocacy surrounding these many social justice issues I had spoken of just now, I've been attending the Indigenous Youth Policy School with the Canadian Roots Exchange to learn how to change policies within government and organizations, as there's a lot of work and decolonial work that needs to be done. I also recently started working towards my business called Inukshuk Insights. I made a YouTube video so far, and I'm still business planning. My mission with that is to bring awareness to the growing issue of human trafficking to aid in the prevention of the national crisis concerning missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, plus through effective advocacy and expanding my knowledge throughout my life in order to make spaces for Indigenous peoples to feel safe in society, especially on our own Indigenous land and Indigenous territory. My vision is to be a good role model for my community by providing my insights regarding social justice issues, intergenerational trauma affecting Indigenous communities, climate justice, systemic racism, and cultural revitalization, with the goal to aid in expanding the consciousness of others surrounding these issues, as they are interconnected and are also a legacy of colonial violence.
Thanks, Bryanna. That also very exciting to hear about your business. Very fun. So I'll chat with you about that. I'm very interested to learn more.
Thank you.
Thanks for your work on that. And next up we have Maureen.
Awesome, thanks. So in thinking about how to answer this question, I did a lot of self-reflection. I think it's hard in a way to describe my work when I still feel like I'm finding my voice. But I guess when I think of my work, or just the work in general, the first thing I think of is how do I show up for the communities that I'm a part of? And I think I'd say that I show up for them in a couple of ways, I hope. So for one, is a really careful listener. So I try to listen not only to what my my family members and relatives are saying, but also where they're coming from, and try to hold space for them. I also show up as a writer, as I guess that's when I feel my voice is most powerful, which is kind of funny given that so many of our nations did a lot of storytelling, but I guess that's colonization for you. I've written letters to editors in newspapers. I've written letters to doctors that have treated me poorly. And when I was in school, I wrote letters to the administration. So I feel like that's, yeah, just a really good way to feel like my voice is heard, I guess, and hopefully to amplify others' voices as well. I show up with my voice at times at rallies and protests, although it does involve pushing myself out of my comfort zone. I moved to Thunder Bay shortly before the pandemic began, so it has kind of been hard to be present in community. But in that short time, I saw that there are so many really awesome Indigenous folks doing some really cool organizing work there, or here rather, so I'm really excited for that. And finally, I show up as someone who promotes well-being, I would say, which means a couple of different things for me. So my kind of training in the Western sense of the word is in public health. So in 2019, I graduated from the Master of Public Health program at the University of Toronto. And I tried to focus lots of my coursework and research not only on the factors that impact our well-being as humans, but also how this is kind of connected to the well-being of our non-human relatives. So this connection is obviously something we've always known as Indigenous people, but fields like public health are just kind of catching up. So that was a really interesting experience, and I think I'm still trying to understand how to apply what I learned in school in like the real world now that I'm out and going through this transition into like a new phase in my life. But I'm currently working for a regional public health unit in Northern Ontario as a health promotion planner, and my portfolio is dedicated to Indigenous health and engagement. So a big part of my job is thinking about what cultural safety and anti-racism look like in the context of public health. So of course, there's not any simple or straightforward answer to those questions, but I think it's a really important one because we really need to be well to do climate action work and other work. And at the same time, our wellness is intimately connected with that of our non-human relatives, which I said earlier. So it's really one of those cycles that I think is hard to break, especially because we're working in a system that was literally meant to terminate us, relevant to the whole Canada Day conversation, right? So for this reason, I approach my work as a form of harm reduction. It's about mitigating the harms that systems like public health perpetuate until we get to the point where we have our own systems in place. And this is already happening, but the change is slow. So this is my role for now. And in the future, I hope that I can take what I've learned to kind of help accelerate this change. So miigwech, thanks.
Thanks, Maureen. Yeah, definitely very important to think about kind of all of these different intersecting things. And yeah, healthcare is something that outside of like thinking of the healthcare system as being very difficult for a lot of Indigenous folks to access. I guess, yeah, I don't like think about it, you know, kind of anymore beyond that. So it's good to know that we have Indigenous folks that are in there in the system that are trying to change it for the better for everyone. And with that, finally, in this round, we have Christopher.
Hi again. So I joined Indigenous Climate Action Steering Committee this year. So this is a new context for my work. And I'll just say that I see the work of Indigenous Climate Action as an important part of a global Indigenous peoples movement around climate justice and other related issues, including Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous peoples' rights globally. But I see myself as a person, a people within that movement, though I don't bring to it particular expertise in climate change or climate action. Most of my work is around education. So I've done a lot of work around community education, employment related work in Jojage, Montreal. I'm an educator in different contexts. I've been a secondary school teacher, and I do some part-time course lecturing presently at McGill University, and some more informal, I guess, community-based political education work has always woven its way into the work that I do in community organizations. I have an interest in bringing these critical perspectives on colonialism and Indigenous peoples' experiences within that, in history, to this kind of political education work. I have a special interest in, I guess, in my own work on urban Indigenous peoples' experiences, struggles, organizing. That comes out of my own, I guess, positioning as someone who's really, I guess, integrated into an urban Indigenous community in Montreal, and a particular interest in Indigenous education within urban contexts. I'm also a PhD student presently. I began last year, and my research is around land education for urban Native people, as well as urban Native students' experiences with public schooling. One really interesting community-based project I'm a part of that has an affiliation with Concordia University and is really led by this team of urban Indigenous people in Montreal with Indigenous women's leadership within it and two-spirited people's leadership within it. So we've been organizing initiatives for land-based learning for urban Native young people who've experienced disconnection from their own nations for historical reasons within their families. And there's a focus around building community, going out on the land, connecting with elders and knowledge holders from different nations and with particular cultural traditions. There's a focus, I guess, also on political education within that context. So confronting and challenging the legacies of colonialism within urban Indigenous community context. And there's a real focus on inclusivity in land education in this context, where there's a real focus on accessibility, inclusivity of two-spirited LGBTQ people and access to ceremony and knowledge, learning within that. So I'm part of that, an advisory board that connects also with my own research in different ways. Yeah, and there's also a big focus, I suppose, on thinking about human-land relations within that context, and how can we live differently in relation to the lands we inhabit. What does that mean for urban Indigenous peoples who come from diverse places and traditions, and how can we connect together to the lands which we inhabit, I guess ethically in ways that support ecological well-being, as well as well-being of our communities, which are not separate, in fact. Yeah, so my work really connects with education and urban Native peoples. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. I want to be a part of that program when it's done. I would love to do that as someone who's urban and Native.
Okay, well, come here then.
Great.
You can participate.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for just sharing part of your work. I'll just share that before we came on live, we're having kind of a little bit of a discussion around like imposter syndrome and different ways to be an activist, because sometimes there can be kind of this this idea that activism almost only counts if you're out in the streets, or you have the microphone. And not that those things aren't important, because they are, but just recognizing that there are so many different ways to be an activist and so many different ways to do work that's good for our communities. And so I think that y'all on this panel, that's really showcasing that all of these different kinds of work that you can do that are still advocating for the cause. So just kind of recognizing that there's a multitude of different ways to do activism. We've talked about law, we've talked about human trafficking, research, healthcare, different political spheres, international work. So I think it's really great that we could have a panel of folks that are doing very different kinds of work. so that we can still recognize that though being out on the streets is great, at the same time, there's also still all of this, background work that needs to be done as well. So again, thank you all for joining us. This is great to be able to have this conversation. And next, kind of, the purpose, if you will, of why we're here today. A lot of it is around Anti-Canada Day, Decolonial Day, Unsettling Canada Day, whatever you want to call it. And just kind of some reflections on today and what that means as Indigenous peoples from all over the world. Or not all over the world, sorry, from all over so-called Canada. For me, I'll just say that it's a day that's very difficult. I'm originally from the so-called United States, actually, so our Independence Day is coming up soon as well. And it's just interesting to kind of reflect on just seeing still the kind of persistent ignorance, and not ignorance and trying to, call people, it's not calling people stupid or anything. It's just that in a lot of cases, people are just really ignorant as to the history of so-called Canada and Turtle Island in general, genocide, colonization, all of these different things, and how we're always continuously learning, even for myself, as an activist, as an Indigenous woman, always learning these different things about other communities as well. So Canada Day, Anti-Canada Day, really gives us, I think, an opportunity to reflect on how far we've come as Indigenous peoples, being forced to fight for our rights, really, across Turtle Island. And then also just kind of showcasing like the work that still needs to be done, not only within our own communities, but also to build intersectional movements with other communities. So there's still so much work that's left to be done, but while also still recognizing that there is so much work that we have done within our communities. All of the people on our panel are really speaking to the different work that they're doing, and it's great to have such empowered Indigenous people on this panel. So just kind of for this next question, we'll do a round robin style again, but just talking about some reflections about so-called Canada Day. What do you think about Canada Day? Why is the work that you're doing so important? What are some things that, maybe action items for other people that are watching this? What are some things that are important with that? So just kind of a multitude of questions, thinking about reflecting on Canada Day. So we'll go ahead, and with that question, we'll start with Bryanna.
Hi, so reflecting on Canada Day, I mostly do think about the silent struggles that many Indigenous women go through, and how we are silenced, and my experiences in the past as a pedestrian vehicle accident survivor when I was trying to go to university when I was 18, and trying to go to the doctor, and the doctor's assuming each time that I went to the emergency department that I was either drunk or high because of my respiratory issues and my imbalance in my walking due to the injuries sustained from the vehicle accident. And then also due to that, not having the proper documentation that I needed to give to my teachers, my professors at university, to have more time on my work, and therefore really struggling in school. I was struggling with walking, let alone with schoolwork. So that's something that really bothers me sometimes, because I think about how I went to the emergency department about like 8 times in a row without being seen. And then the last time I went to the doctor, they looked at my chart, they saw that I was taking medication for my ADHD, and I really thought that they were going to call the police on me, thinking that I was high. So I just left right away, thinking that they would call the cops and I would end up in jail. And then that made me think about the overrepresentation of incarcerated Indigenous youth, and that's how people end up in jail so easily, for sure. And I read, I think, as well, that about 85 or 87% of women incarcerated have a traumatic brain injury. And I was not, at that time, I was not diagnosed for my brain injury, so I was still struggling throughout the next couple years of my life. After I wasn't able to get healthcare, I moved to another province to try and see if I could get healthcare there, and ended up becoming a victim of human trafficking due to my my disability, poverty, homelessness, lack of healthcare, like so many issues. And I had reached out to many organizations and had such trouble like just communicating with people during that time. And I saw very easily and educated myself more and more about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls because of that. And I found out that this is happening to many more women, and not just Indigenous women. Even though Indigenous women are the most human trafficked in Canada, the next group of people close to Indigenous people are international women. And I have so many friends who are, oh, sorry, I just need some water, who are from different countries and come to Canada and have issues with housing, poverty, finding a job, food insecurity, and end up becoming victims to human trafficking. And it's just so easy for that to happen. And the lack of appropriate, I think, training that people have in many organizations across Canada really does contribute to the issue of human trafficking, which is upsetting. And that's the reason that I am really working towards the work that I'm doing. So yeah, hopefully I didn't trigger anybody too much with that, but that's the type of work that I want to do. And yeah, hopefully things change.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, Bryanna. Yeah, hearing your story really does, get at all the systemic issues that so many Indigenous peoples face across so-called Canada. Coming from the States, I always find it very funny that Canada has such like a good PR team. Like being in the US, so many people think Canada is like this haven of, everybody has like human rights and free healthcare and education, and it's a multicultural melting pot. It's such a great place. So yeah, it was very interesting and shocking also to, come up here and see that the same issues that folks south of the Medicine Line are facing are exactly the same up here. Lack of access to basically any sort of basic essential services, racism by multiple forms of services, healthcare, housing, all these different things. So yeah, thank you for sharing and for doing the work that you're doing and bringing these issues to light. And with that, speaking of, oh, did you want to respond?
Oh no, I just said thank you.
Speaking of healthcare, we'll go to Maureen next.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Lindsey. And thanks, Bryanna, so much for sharing your story. Really important, and I hope that everyone online is kind of holding space. So I think when we talk about the founding of so-called Canada, which was built on the oppression and really the attempted extermination of Indigenous people, often we'll hear, well, that's in the past. And then, there are some people that will actually acknowledge it, but they'll say, we as Canadians still enjoy rights that many around the world don't, which is worth celebrating. And, my first response is always that I'm not Canadian. I'm an Anishinaabe. Furthermore, you and I don't have the same rights. So I'm a status Indian. And what this means is, even as an adult, I'm legally considered a ward of the state. And that's something a lot of people don't know. That is because of the Indian Act, which still exists today. So Canada has really committed countless human rights violations against Indigenous people. We also have a really poor record of following contraventions of UNDRIP, which is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Canada was actually one of the 4 countries that were initially opposed to the declaration. And all of this is really well documented. A lot of folks probably already know this, but if you do want to learn more, you can do some research. But just kind of saying that for some context and bringing it back to what Lindsey, you were just saying about how tough these conversations are to have because of the narratives surrounding Canada being this kind of multicultural, peaceful haven. You know, because those narratives are so prevalent, it just makes the conversations really tough to have. So perfect example, I think last year, I was really privileged to spend 4 months working on Ngunnawal country in so-called Canberra, Australia. So both before and after my trip, when I would tell people where I was going or where I had been, they would say, oh, isn't it just horrible how Australia treated their Aboriginal people? Colonization was so much worse there, blah, blah, blah. So my response would be, for one, it's not a past tense thing. It still happens. Two, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people don't belong to Australia, just like Indigenous people here don't belong to Canada. And three, what makes you think that Canada is any better? So of course, you know, there were in our differences in how colonization played out across both of these kind of settler states. I don't want to essentialize that, but there were also a lot and are a lot of similarities. And it's just really interesting to me that so many people seem to feel that Canada could just absolve itself of all this while Australia couldn't. That was my experience with so many conversations I had at that time in my life. And yeah, I guess Canada is not and never will be the exception, even though it's really portrayed to be that way, like you said, Lindsey. And of course, you know, I do recognize that Canada has been a refuge and safe haven for some. So my partner is from the Philippines. We've had some really productive conversations about this over the last few years. You know, I respect what coming to Canada has meant for him and his family, and he realizes that his family's experience coming here would never have really been possible without my family's oppression. And, you know, in that sense, what really ties us together is the shared experience of colonization, which is ultimately what really created the conditions that made him and his family want to leave home in the first place. So yeah, these are really, really tough conversations to have. But I just want to thank anyone who's on the live who's trying to hear other people out and listen to their voices, because this is something that's really kind of ingrained in us from like day one as a young child. So yeah, thanks for doing the work. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Maureen. Yeah, just kind of with what you were saying, yeah, at the ending as well, you know, yeah, one thinking about intersectional movement building, like, what does that mean? Especially with, you know, with the Black Lives Matter protests that have been happening, and doing some solidarity work around that. You know, I've been doing some reading and thinking about, like, we can't, like with, you know, so many migrants that come to so-called Canada, that like those people aren't settlers in the way that we talk about colonizers, you know. So even in terms of, you know, our own communities thinking about this dichotomy that many of us have, that you're either Indigenous or you're a settler, but it's so much more complicated than that, you know. There are so many people who also have been forced to leave their home territories because of colonization, because of oppression. So yeah, just, it's really good to think more and more about intersectional movement building and how, even though we're different, there's so many similarities across groups that have been systemically oppressed. So yeah, thank you very much for bringing that up, Maureen. And next we're going to go to Christopher.
Thank you. Yeah, just hearing Bryanna, Maureen speak, it also got me thinking, like, who is Canada for? That's a question we can ask, right? We can think of Canada as a kind of project for certain people and not for certain other people. And I've been thinking about right now throughout North America, there is a major rebellion underway against what I guess people call racial capitalism, against police, against incarceration, against structural other dimensions of widespread social inequality, etc. And it's also a time when there's been some reckoning with monuments, right? And how we think of the past, how we think about histories of colonialism. And so I was thinking, well, Canada Day itself is a kind of monument, right, to colonialism and violence, right? One that we also, I think, must reckon with. So in preparing, I was doing some thinking around the history of Canada Day and what what it is that it's acknowledging, that it's celebrating, commemorating, and I'll share with you a bit of what I've been thinking around that. So apparently Canada Day began as Dominion Day in 1879. This was an important period in the late 19th century in the history of colonialism, settler colonialism, and in the formation of Canada. 79, of course, is only 12 years after Canada itself emerged through the British North America Act, or Constitution Act of 1867, right? That's what Canada Day supposedly celebrates, is this moment, this formation of Canada in 1867, 153 years ago. It became Canada Day in 82, when the Canadian Constitution was repatriated from the British Crown. But it was Dominion Day for a long time, right? And we hear this term a lot. Dominion refers to Canadian sovereignty, Canadian authority, formerly British authority over usurped or stolen Indigenous lands, right? It's a kind of claim to lands that are Indigenous by a colonizing state. And so Dominion Day, right, in 1879, it first emerged in this really key period in the history of Canadian colonialism, right? We have the Constitution Act 1867, which Canada Day commemorates. The next year we have the Rupert's Land Act, in which there was a unilateral acquisition of Hudson Bay Company lands, and an annexation by the Canadian state of Indigenous lands. And then we have this whole series of things happening. The Secretary of State is created in '68, which becomes this bureaucratic structure for managing the lands of so-called Indians. The Gradual Enfranchisement Act in the late '60s as well, which replaced Indigenous authority and jurisdiction in their territories, in a sense, and imposed the band council system that's under the control of the new federal state. We have the Dominions Land Act at the same time, right, creating individual property over a vast area, western so-called Canada. The creation of the Northwest Mounted Police in '73, the Indian Act in 1876, the Department of the Interior in 1880, right? And all throughout this period, we have military intervention, displacement, starvation policies, ecological destruction. We had Red River and Northwest resistances. There's a lot happening in a short period during this moment of the early formation of Canada. And these are some of the things that are being celebrated, right? These are constitutive of Canada itself, and part of the celebration is the celebration of these events that were foundational, I guess, or fundamental to Canada's coming into being. And so the major thing that Canada Day supposedly celebrates is this British North America Act, right? The Constitution Act, 1867, right? This is Canada's first constitution, represented a transfer of stolen Indigenous territories from the British Crown to the new Canadian state. And it had a lot of importance in determining how Canada would function, right? It set up the system of government that would operate in the Canadian state. And there was these jurisdictional categories created, right? Famously, Section 9124 determines that the federal government has authority exclusively over so-called Indians and lands reserved for Indians. And Section 92, which sets out, I guess, matters of provincial jurisdiction, among other things, provides control of so-called crown lands to the provinces. And this is a really important moment, right? The category Indian is kind of more concretely realized in Canadian law. It becomes this important legal category, and the Canadian state assumes authority or jurisdiction over in governing those who fall within this category and their lands, right? And so we have these real frontier logics of appropriation, right? Appropriating a right to govern so-called Indian nations. And then we have this expropriation at the same time, expropriation of their lands and this unilateral absorption of Indigenous lands into so-called Canada. And so the British North America Act, which many are celebrating today, right? This is rendering diverse Indigenous peoples as Indians, right? Collapsing these diverse nations into this single category and subjecting communities and people to the authority of the state, right? Rather than apprehending Indigenous peoples as sovereign nations, right? There's kind of a total abandonment of whatever extent of a kind of nation-to-nation relationship that formerly might have existed. And so it's this really critical moment in the history of colonialism. So Indigenous peoples now subject to Canadian law, subject to policing, because we are apprehended as subjects of the Crown, later as citizens. And then there are major implications, I think, over decades and up until the present into, well, connecting with ICA's work, right? We have in how Indigenous lands become privately owned and how industrial development unfolds. And so connections with the ecological and climate crisis. And then the British North America Act in explaining that party of this Canadian state, it creates the possibility for the Indian Act to emerge, right? And this is obviously a really critical development, right? And, for First Nations within so-called Canada. And so when we talk about, there's a lot of talk right now, right, about systemic racism, right? In Quebec, apparently people don't understand what that means. There isn't, what does the systemic part mean, right? Well, this is, I think, a really good example, right? So the systems, the state systems configuration through the British North America Act and then later legislation and sort of institutions literally produces a racial category out of a collectivity of peoples and who are now subject to its laws. And so I think thinking about this history is really important when we think about Canada Day. And the other thing that I wanted to connect it to is connecting it to, I guess, the present rebellion that we're seeing through globally, right, in the Black Lives Matter movement and those who are supporting it. So there's been a lot of talk of sort of the abolition framework, and which is, I'm a learner of the abolition framework now. I don't claim any expertise in addressing it, so I'm doing a lot of learning right now, as I think a lot of people are. But this framework, I think, has been really advanced, especially by Black women and writers, thinkers who've been doing this work for decades, right? So it's new to me, and in thinking, I guess, in this particular way about colonialism, but I think it's useful thinking about abolition, right? So I learned from Ruth Wilson Gilmore that we need to rethink the social relations, conditions, and problems that policing and prisons become the solution to, right? And so when we're thinking about this in relation to Indigenous peoples in so-called Canada, it throws into question, I think, the legitimacy of the state itself, and that Canada itself, that we need to bring it, the construct of Canada, into, I guess, the sites of this framework, right? So going from, you know, we're thinking about shutting down Canada recently, right? This past winter, the Shut Down Canada movement, right? But I think there's probably a trajectory thinking about abolishing Canada instead, right? So when we think about the Wet'suwet'en peoples who have been fighting to exercise their jurisdiction on their own lands, right? Their actions are literally criminalized by the state, right? So policing becomes, and prisons become a solution to the exercise of Indigenous jurisdiction. So we need to think about, I think, maybe using this framework as well in how we analyze Canadian colonialism. I think it could bring a real depth and strategic value to thinking this through. Anyway, those are the things I've been thinking about, trying to connect the present resistant movements to this specific history of the formation of Canada that today commemorates. Yeah.
Thanks, Christopher. I feel like I just need that like history lesson on like a tape recorder. And then anytime somebody talks about Canada being great, just like, wait, but listen to the history though. So thank you for that. That was great, like grounding. That was amazing.
It's my pleasure, thank you.
Amazing. And I really like, yeah, how you started it as well, talking about when we talk about Canada Day, like who is that for though? Like it's not for us. It's not for Indigenous peoples. It's not a day for us. You know, being from the States again, and, you know, similar thing, thinking about American Independence Day on July 4th, you know, that's not for Indigenous, that's not for any person of color, really. Black, Indigenous, POC, that's not for any of those people, Independence Day. You know, you can't really talk about Independence Day when when independence was achieved during genocide of Indigenous peoples and slavery by the so-called founding fathers. So really illustrates the whole hypocrisy of these of colonizers. So thank you again for that great kind of pulling it all together. Yeah, and then next up we've got Daniel.
All right. So I wanted to, rather than reflect on a specific event, incident, campaign, or piece of work, I wanted to ask the question of, in the context of climate change and the climate crisis, what do we need to do and what is effective to accomplish that? I think those are important things for people to reflect on. And I'll preface this by saying that I think there's a lot of people out there. I know there's a lot of people out there, probably a lot on this live stream, who this is obvious to. Like there's a lot of young people who are out there hitting it hard. We saw that this last winter. But I think it's still important to acknowledge some of this stuff. So what do we need to do to stop climate change? I think to answer that question, it's important to apply a climate justice framework, a lens, and look at climate change not just as an issue of science or the environment or carbon dioxide, but to use that climate justice framework to identify the structural causes of climate change. Structural causes in the societies on our lands and lands all over the world that need to be addressed. And the oppressive power structures that have been identified as root causes of climate change and the current climate crisis are colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy. So if we don't address those oppressive power structures, we will not be able to stop climate change. So that's what we need to do. That's not the only thing we need to do, but that is a necessary thing to do. And so I also want to talk about what is effective? What is effective strategy and tactics in doing the work of somehow trying to dismantle capitalism, dismantle colonialism, and end patriarchy? What do we need to actually embrace as strategy to do that? And I want to come right out of the gate and say that law and engagement with Canadian governments and governance structures is not going to accomplish what we need to do. Any system of change that is state sanctioned on its own is not going to stop climate change. We need to go beyond that. The system of Canadian law, using it may be helpful, it may even be necessary. I don't know if it is, but it might be. But on its own, it will not stop climate change. It will not dismantle colonialism. It will not get us to that point where we can say that we have really started to see and embrace Indigenous sovereignty on our lands. The law is a colonial system, and it was built to protect the power structure of colonialism and to support the types of things that people have been talking about, the dispossession of Indigenous people from our lands and the exploitation of those lands so that non-Indigenous populations can grow rich from hydrocarbons and minerals. So that's an important point that I wanted to make. We have to be looking at Indigenous sovereignty beyond just the limited confines of Canadian constitutional law, Aboriginal law, and Canadian government negotiations on things like land claim and self-government agreements. And so what do we need beyond the legal work and negotiation work, which may or may not be necessary, may or may not be helpful? I don't want to dwell on that. What do we need? I think there are broadly two types of action that we need. And one thing we saw a lot of this past year is we need people who are going to engage in direct action to physically stop hydrocarbon projects and other aspects of the Canadian colonial project. We need people who are willing to go out there being led by Indigenous nations and Indigenous movements. I'm not going to say that we need just Indigenous people to do this, but these movements need to be Indigenous led. But we need people who are going to go out there and actually assert Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous jurisdiction by physically stopping things to which there is not Indigenous consent. That is something that we need, and we need to support those movements, and we need to support the people who are doing that work. There's another aspect to the work of the direct action work and the work of directly challenging power, and that's the more creative work. And I've seen a lot of that, and I think that's exceptionally powerful. So I want to riff on some of the stuff that's been talked about, like this question of, or this statement of I don't identify as Canadian. And that, I think that's incredibly powerful. It's incredibly powerful to say that, and it's incredibly powerful to ask people that question. I was in a workshop in one of our neighboring communities last fall with a lot of young Dene, and that's one thing that we asked them. We asked them, if you're Canadian, when did you become Canadian? And that's a question that I don't think anybody can answer. And I personally, when I ask people this, I rattle off a lot of dates. Some of them Chris talked about. There's the 1867 British North America Act. There's that, like a year or two later, the acquisition of all that Hudson Bay land by Canada. There's the 1921 signing of Treaty 11 that my great-grandfather signed. There is the date that they let us vote, which I think was 1960 or something like that. There's the date of a creation of an actual elected government for the Northwest Territories, 1967. And then there's the 1993 Satu land claim. So we have all these dates, and I asked people, when did we actually become Canadian? Was it before we had the right to vote? Was it when we got the right to vote, but before they actually had a legal claim to our land in the land claim? And there's no clear answer. One of my elders responded to that by saying that at least in his dialect of the Dene language, Deneke, there's no word for Canadian. So the elders can't even express that, even if they wanted to. There's no way to say I am Canadian in that dialect. So it's important to question those things and point that out, because that is a powerful colonial narrative. That narrative that we are Canadian is extremely powerful. And the story that Canada has sovereignty over all of our land, this story of crown sovereignty, is incredibly powerful. And there's creative action and work that people do using story-based strategy that is designed to tease out and challenge these assumptions and these colonial narratives and force people to think about them and acknowledge them. You physically and literally cannot do that when you engage with Canadian law. walking into a court to argue some case, to an extent, you need to accept the assumption of Crown sovereignty, and you need to accept the assumption that all of us as Indigenous people on our lands, or the land, other stolen lands of other Indigenous people, you need to accept the assumption that we are all Canadian. And so that's work that I see as incredibly valuable, because power operates on the basis of consent. Canada's power as a hierarchy, its power over us and our lands, is propped up by our consent and by the consent of Canadians. And one of the things that props up Canadian power are these colonial narratives of things like Crown sovereignty and all of us being Canadian. And when we don't question those narratives, we continue to let those narratives prop up Crown and Canadian power over us and our lands. When we start to question those narratives, that's when we really start to weaken the support structures for Canada's power as a power over hierarchy over us and our lands. So I think some of that story-based strategy work, attacking those narratives and really pulling out and then pinpointing those assumptions that prop up this power structure, that work is essential if we are actually going to start getting to that point where we can really embrace and realize Indigenous sovereignty on land that is claimed by Canada. So I'll leave it at that for now. Merci, thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Wow, I feel like just mind blown by all of that. So that was great. Thank you so much. Yeah, just really kind of, again, getting at the different structures, kind of back to Christopher's point of, who is this for, when thinking about the legal system as well. Who is the legal system for? Because it's definitely not for us. So who is it for then? So yeah, thank you for giving that whole grounding, kind of bringing us back again to thinking about, how do we facilitate change? What are these, these different ways to go about making change while we're within a colonial settler structure, capitalist structure as well. So thank you. And finally, to round out this round of reflecting on so-called Canada Day, we're going to have Brendan.
Okay. So yeah, thank you everybody for your thoughts. As someone with ADHD, I think my brain has moved around to a lot of different things in reflecting about Canada Day. I think I want to add on to what Daniel was saying. In Cree, from what I gather, we don't have a word for Canada. We have a word for or Canadian. We have a word for white person, which comes from the word Montreal, Monial. At least that's what I learned. But yeah, no, I think in reflecting on what everyone just said here, I think my biggest reflection about today is how do we get other people to the points that we are? All of us are at very different learning or different points in our learning journey, and we're very far along relative to I guess the general public in different ways and along different learning journeys we've had. I think for me, honestly, everything I've learned has been really quick, and it's been in the last 5 years of my life. And I'm just wondering how we can get our own communities and our own families to the points that we're at, but also how we can connect to other communities in so-called Canada, because there's a lot of people doing a lot of important work for their communities. And by that I'm largely referring to Black organizers in Toronto and Ottawa and in Halifax and in Vancouver. I'm referring to migrant justice organizers that I know that are doing work out of Winnipeg or out of Toronto, or again in Halifax. And I think trying to bring all of these narratives together has been something that's really important to me personally, but I really don't have any clear answers as to how that is done, just because there's simply so much to learn. As an organizer, I usually focus on inter-community learning, And I think part of it was informed by when I went to Morocco and was able to learn different stories from different indigenous peoples around the world. But I think it's also informed by my experience as an organizer, where so many non-indigenous folks, non-native folks, non-aboriginal folks who aren't white have like held so much space and shown so much support for indigenous organizing. And I don't really have too much to say because again, I don't have any answers. But I'm hoping that you know, we can take today as an opportunity to learn about each other's struggles and to learn about how to create inter-community spaces again outside of the state, outside of the Canadian state, because I'm pretty sure everyone on this panel agrees that Canada really isn't here for us Indigenous peoples. But if you look at the history of Canada, it's also been incredibly xenophobic or anti-Chinese. It's incredibly anti-Black, and it's a white supremacist colonial settler colonial state. So I'm hoping that today can be like a continuation of inter-community dialogue, so that we can show solidarity, you know, with Black organizers who are organizing across Turtle Island, with migrant justice organizers. And I think there's a lot of power that we would have as Indigenous peoples, because, you know, these are our various homelands, right? So there are various laws that we have within our own traditional teachings, within our own traditional laws, Indigenous legal systems that can, you know, be very empowering to this work about how we make space for non-white newcomers, about how we make, you know, how we address like systemic violence, you know, how we operate outside of capitalism. And I think that's where I'm reflecting at largely right now and today, just because there's literally so much going on right now. I'm sure each of us could probably name so many things through this panel as like a, you know, a drop to like, you know, being to encourage people to be aware of different things that are going on. So yeah, I think my ADHD brain is just kind of exploded in a good way, with what everyone has said, just left thinking, and hoping for more solidarity, and there's already a lot. So
Thank you so much, Brendan. Yeah, one thing that I've been reflecting on a lot lately as we talk, you know, more and more about intersectionality and, you know, cross movement, solidarity, and all of these different things is, one thing I really like to think about is like what it means to be an ally versus what it means to be like an accomplice or a co-conspirator. Like, you know, an ally might just, you know, maybe post something here and there like on Facebook, but, you know, the co-conspirators are the people that like Daniel's talking about, that are the ones like out, you know, out on the streets with us. Like, they're the people that are putting themselves between like Indigenous folks and police. Like, those are the people who are like, yes, we will like take your lead, but, you know, we also recognize that we have our own power and privilege. So all about like getting more co-conspirators within the movement. And also as well, just what you were talking about, Brendan, made me think of, in doing activism, I did a migrant rights network training, God, I don't know how many, pre-COVID anyway. And one of the things that that they were talking about is that you have to be willing to make mistakes when you're doing activism work. Like, you're not always going to get it right. You're going to like say the wrong thing sometimes. You're going to like accidentally offend someone. You're not going to know a certain history or like a certain protocol. And when doing, you know, any sort of activism work, a lot of it really is about being willing to learn constantly. So, you know, how we're talking about this panel, like people bringing up so many different things. It's about just constantly learning and being able to take what people are talking about. And if somebody calls you out or calls you in, then like being able to accept that, and have humility about it, and like take that wisdom, you know, and to use it moving forward. So I really like, yeah, to think about just in terms of like activist culture, how is it that we can, you know, better cultivate a culture in which people feel like they can come in and they can like fuck up essentially and not be like completely cut off from the movement. So I think that's something else that's really important for us to think about, especially, you know, as Indigenous folks, having so many people who are, you know, well-meaning, but maybe at times say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, or, you know, maybe they don't necessarily know like the history of colonialism, but they still want to support Indigenous peoples. So how can we keep bringing those people in and making co-conspirators out of our allies as well? And so just kind of with that on an ending note, because we have about 15 minutes left, I just wanted to ask people to kind of talk about what is something that you're excited about that's happening with Indigenous peoples. Like what's something that's getting you jazzed? Like, you know, it can be, you know, a project, a person, organization. Doesn't have to be within your own community. It can be anywhere else in so-called Canada, even beyond so-called Canada. But yeah, just something that you're really, you know, excited to see happen and to be moving. So we'll just do kind of a little bit of a quicker round robin with this one maybe, and we'll start with Christopher.
I guess build off some of Brendan's comments towards the end where he was talking about seeing connections between movements. I guess one thing that I found, or that I am finding exciting about 2020, right, is that there has been, you know, real mass kind of mobilization around different interrelated issues, like thinking about the Wet'suwet'en land struggles solidarity movement that expanded across North America and beyond in the winter, moving into the kinds of organizing that we've seen in the wake of, you know, in terms of like pandemic response, community level sort of organizing, but also a lot of solidarity work there, and then into, you know, the resurgence of the movement for Black Lives globally, right? Like all of these things that are happening simultaneously and I guess serially in a sense too. It's a real kind of mass mobilization of people that Indigenous peoples, obviously in Wet'suwet'en movement and solidarity movement, there have been a lot of Indigenous peoples front and center, but I think Indigenous peoples and responses at the community level to the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think some Indigenous communities are finding good ways to express their solidarity with the global Black Lives Matter movement, and I think looking for ways of connecting those things, right? They're all responding to I guess features of the structures that are sort of inherent in capitalism, colonialism, and so finding, I think, space to connect those, but really, I guess, to build between them, like Brendan expressed, right? Like finding, I guess, a vocabulary for talking about those connections. And Lindsey, you're speaking about, right? How do we name the work we're doing? Right, the name of, I think, comrade is this other term that gets used. It's useful, right? Seeing comrades in each other across different movements, and then, right, that's a term that comes from, I guess, the socialist organizing tradition, but is useful in thinking about how we relate to one another, right? Instead of how do we self-identify, self-label ourselves in terms of our politics, but right, how do we work together, right, in solidarity? So it's not one specific thing, but I think it's the phenomenon of this scaling up, I suppose, of resistance, of movements recently. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, definitely. We need some more comrades. All about that as we talk about dismantling capitalism as well. Daniel, what are you excited about?
Well, first, I'm excited about and give a shout out to everyone, young and old, and from wherever, who's working on tanning moose hides, or caribou hides, or deer hides, or any other kind of hides, because that's really awesome to see more people getting involved in that and learning that. And I think that's so important, at least from where I'm from, to ground a lot of what it means to be Dene. From language to our Dene law, is you can relate it somehow to the broader process of working on hides. So I'm really stoked about that, to see people doing that this summer. But I also want to follow up on some of what Brendan and Christopher were saying. I'm really excited to see a lot of the organizing that's been happening right now. And what I'm excited for anyone who is doing, any Indigenous people who are doing work to support the Black Lives Matter movement, and to address that white supremacy and Islamophobia and that type of racism in our communities, because I know where I'm from, that work needs to happen. There is that racism and white supremacy and those attitudes and that oppression exists in our communities towards Black people and people of color. And we need to do something about that. So I'm excited when people do that work, because I've realized that I don't have the resources. I don't know how to do that work, and I want to know how to do that work. And I have a lot of respect for people who are doing that work. And I think more of it needs to happen. I've seen a lot of support from Black people and POC organizers and movements, a lot of support for Indigenous sovereignty, and I don't see that the reciprocity from our side that I think is really warranted. Liberation is not a zero-sum game, and I think we're stronger together than we are separately, and we need to be supporting each other more. And I've seen other movements of people of color supporting Indigenous movements, and I think Indigenous movements and Indigenous communities and nations really need to be supporting non-Indigenous people of color who are struggling against the same oppressive systems that we are. So I'm really excited when I see people who are doing that work, and I want to learn more about it. So hit me up. Merci.
Thanks, Daniel. I feel like I need that on a t-shirt, like liberation is not a zero-sum game. That'd be great. Next, we're going to go to Brendan.
So I think what I'm excited about, again, just kind of following on this thread, and but also trying to like do I guess like a name drop of some organizers I know. I'm looking forward to just different Afro-Indigenous organizing that is happening in so-called Canada. I have two friends, one that I went to school with and one I've been following from afar, who've created like an Instagram account that is working toward that. So if folks want to follow that, it's Afro-Indigenous Kin, just all one word. And I think it's really important that the work they're doing, because this is a perspective that is so often like ignored in our communities. Like our communities do have a huge issue with appropriating Black culture and appreciating different things like hip hop and using African American vernacular English, but then also perpetuating anti-Blackness. And there's also huge issues as they talk about just Afro-Indigenous folks not feeling validated in our communities, and because of their Blackness and because they present as Black. Yet there's, people like me and other white passing and light skinned Native folks who don't have to go through those same struggles of being welcomed and included. So I think that the work they're doing is pretty amazing. And I just wanted to, I guess, name drop them and hope that people can follow and amplify them. Thank you.
Thanks, Brendan. Yes, we love a good name drop. Yes, and very much like thank you to the folks that are doing that work. It's very important, as everyone's kind of addressed, not only talking about cross movement work, but also that work within our own communities as well, to build solidarity and also to recognize and to honor the different identities within our community as well. Next, Bryanna.
What I'm really excited about is land back. I'm excited about land back. I came up with that on June 10th, 2019, when I was staying at Lindsey's house for the mega dams protests here in Ottawa. And after that, I was really excited to see the amount of support that came from that and the amount of people that ended up saying land back. Which made me so happy, and it helped me to feel less isolated in my struggle with social justice issues and discrimination, which is isolation is a large contributing issue or factor to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So helping, like, by people saying land back and using it on their clothing and in their beading, like there's hats, there's hoodies, there's blankets, there's earrings, everything. It just really makes me feel more included. And also I really enjoy it because it stimulates Indigenous economy, because people are selling these items with land back on it, which makes me really, really, really happy to see. I'm definitely supportive of Black Lives Matter. My fiance is from Senegal. He's Black, so my family is Black, and my other family is Indigenous. So and they've been always so supportive of me and really helpful to take me out of my isolation as well, and to cope with a lot of the PTSD that I have from discrimination. And we can share a lot in our struggle, which is, and educate each other. And I really, really, really am grateful for that. So Black lives certainly do matter, and everybody needs to know that. Everybody needs to get on that now. If you're not, you need to get on that. And I also really like Indigenous music. That's something that really excites me. I absolutely love music like Sela and Rise, Jakota, Cody Coyote, Snotty Nose Res Kids, Isque. There's a guy I know, Brett Lee, he's in Alberta. And I'm also excited about renewable energy projects. When I lived in Alberta very briefly, I met a youth chief from the Tsuut'ina First Nation. His name is Stephen Crowchild, and they had put up solar panels on the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and it's beautiful. Like, it's amazing the work that they're doing. So I'm so excited about that. Thank you.
Yeah, all the different things. Yes, very much. Yeah, thinking of sovereignty in multiple ways. Like, you know, talking about having, you know, control and being able to contribute to music and food and yeah, clothing, beating, all these different things. So yes, definitely everyone support Indigenous businesses as well. Musicians, clothing designers, all of it. Yes, buy Indigenous. And then finally, Maureen, to round us out.
Yeah, thanks for this question, Lindsay. It's a really good one, and also a really hard one, because I think there's so much going on that is just great to see from my perspective. I would say, you know, first and foremost, just seeing Indigenous youth and young people kind of reclaiming from day one is so exciting to me. Like seeing little tots at the powwow, like seeing youth like being raised speaking their language. It's not something that I experienced growing up. And it's just so awesome to see. So like all the parents who are out there doing that work, like, you are awesome. And it's so important. Another thing I think that's really exciting to see for me is you know, connections between Indigenous folks from different like settler states. So like, you know, thinking about how our experiences as Indigenous folks, like on both sides of the medicine line, kind of align also with like folks in Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's really exciting. And I've had the privilege of kind of creating some of those connections, as I mentioned, and it really fundamentally changed the way that I think about myself and my experiences in a very positive way. So I think like that kind of work is awesome. And, you know, in this age of social media, we're able to do more of that, which is great. And then I'll also say in my role as someone working in like public health kind of right now is I'm really excited about some of the indigenous data sovereignty work that's going on. So we're seeing, you know, this push for race-based data, which, you know, is really important to understand how different groups are inequitably affected by certain issues. Like COVID obviously is huge right now. But we also can't have that race-based data collection without like checks and balances and thinking about, you know, data is power in a lot of ways, and how do we make sure that the power isn't just resting with like folks who already have the power, right? Or systems who already have the power. So I think about like some researchers I know who do work like in Australia, the My Kauai study led by that team is really exciting. Our health counts here in so-called Ontario, really exciting. And also the Black Public Health Collective is starting to think about, they put out a statement about, you know, data sovereignty from their perspective and kind of what that means in relation to COVID, in relation to Black Lives Matter. And I think that that's really important. So I would really encourage everyone to read their statement. I think if you Google Black Public Health Collective, it comes up one of the first things, and it's really, really important work. So yeah, there's lots of things I guess I could keep rambling on about, but I'll end it there, kind of being conscious of time. So miigwech.
Thank you, Maureen. Yeah, and thank you everyone for being able to, yeah, give some other shout outs. Yeah, some other ways that folks can get involved with all this great work that's happening across so-called Canada, both within Indigenous communities and outside of Indigenous communities as well. With that, yeah, that was our last question. Before we get going, I just want to let folks know that there are a couple of other events coming up today. So happening right now, actually, with Migrant Rights Network is an event, and that's on their Facebook page, their Facebook Live, as an event called Canada Day What? Fighting Colonialism and Anti-Black Racism. And Indigenous Climate Action's ED Ariel, she's going to be speaking on that, along with Elle Jones, who's an African Nova Scotian activist. So very much recommend that you check that out. And then starting at 5:30 EST, Idle No More is having live feeds from across so-called Canada of different things that are happening. So very much that you, yeah, just keep supporting Indigenous folks and justice on Cancel Canada Day. So thank you again for everyone for tuning in. Thank you to all of our great panelists. Yeah, keep watching ICA socials for more webinars and things like this that are coming up. And thank you all again for tuning in to Anti-Canada Day, Decolonial Day, #Land Back. Thank you, everyone.